Hi, everyone. My name is Matthew Gaunt. I am a developer advocate on the Chrome team. Thank you for joining me for the modern workflow for developing the mobile web, which I must admit, I should have tried to make that a bit snappier. But essentially, where this talk came from is when you look at the development environment for the desktop, the tools and the way you work, it's actually quite mature when you compare it to the mobile web. Whether that be a case of the frameworks you're using, the flow you're working with your IDE to the browsers on your local machine. One way or another, it's particularly easy on the desktop. It lends itself to it. But when you actually start working on the mobile web, you realize a lot of this isn't quite the same. It's not the case. Now, regardless of what your specific workflow is, I'd say you could probably put most of the parts of what you do into these 4 categories. You're going to have a setup stage, whether you're picking what tools, what source control, staging server, production server, all those kinds of things. Then you're going to obviously have the bulk of the work, the hard bit, developing. You're going to have a testing stage, whether that be just you yourself testing in a couple of browsers, automated testing, QA teams. And then obviously, once you've launched, you're going to have the iteration steps, hopefully adding new features, improving on what you've already done. And essentially, what we're going to be looking at is just some of the tools that you can be using in your current workflow for the mobile web to hopefully make it a bit more productive, fit in a bit easier with what you're already doing. So let's start off with setup. Now, I'm not going to go into particular frameworks you guys should be using because I think a lot of that comes down to personal taste. But the one thing that you will need for the mobile web is obviously either testing on a device or on emulators and simulators. And most people will kind of opt for emulators and simulators if it's an option because it's just convenient to have on your desktop where you're already working. But there are a couple of caveats that I'd kind of just raise when you're doing this. One way or another, you should never treat an emulator or a simulator as a replacement for an actual real device. They're great for convenience. They're fantastic for checking out what your layout is actually going to look like. And often it's a case that the APIs, they're a great test bed just to make sure that what you're doing is going to work. The problem is often performance is very different from real-life devices. If you look at an Android emulator, it's particularly slow in comparison to a real device, whether that be a high-end or a low-end device. If you then compare that to some of the simulators that you can get, they'll actually perform really, really well. And then when it comes to testing on a real device, actually performance is really degraded at certain points. So I just wanted to make that point quite clear. Use them because they're awesome and they're really helpful, but don't treat them as a replacement for the real thing. Now, the Android SDK, obviously there's been a slight announcement at the keynote, but essentially, when you go to the web page, there's 2 options. One of them's hidden, which is just the plain SDK. The other one is the ADT, Android Developer Toolkit. ADT will come with Eclipse, or now IntelliJ, as well as the plugins to make it work with the SDK. There is the option of just downloading the SDK if that's all you want, to avoid downloading extra stuff you won't need or use necessarily. But once you download it, the first thing that I'd encourage you to do is just make sure you add platform-tools and tools to your path. Generally, there's going to be a couple of tools that you're going to be regularly relying on. So just make it a bit easier on yourself and just add it to the terminal. It's something that I think can quite easily be overlooked. And 2 of those tools I want to talk about is ADB and Monitor, which will help you set up the Android emulator. So whenever I'm starting development, if I plug in my device and it doesn't do what I'm expecting for whatever program, ADB is the first port of call that I go to. If I run ADB devices, it does a couple of things. One, if ADB server isn't running in the background, it'll actually start it. And if I do actually run it, it doesn't start the server and there's no devices. And that's normally a good sign that something's gone wrong with the USB to the device. So just unplug it and plug it back in. Because ADB is essentially the bridge between your phone and your local machine. And the other tool that you're going to be regularly coming into is Monitor. And you can kind of think of Monitor as just the one-stop shop for all of the Android tools, or at least the majority of them. Now, when you kind of open it, it looks quite daunting at first, but it's really not that bad. So if you look over on the left-hand side, you're going to get a list of devices connected to that machine. So there'll be emulators as well as USB-connected devices. Along the bottom, you're actually going to have Logcat. And what this is the log output from emulators and real devices. Now, if you ever do a hybrid application with a web view, if you do console.log, the messages will actually end up in here. So it might be useful if you ever start working on projects like that. And then the top right, it doesn't necessarily have anything useful for web developers, but it's essentially thread management as well as memory management for native applications. So if you ever wondered what that was, there you go. So along the top, you're going to actually have options to access another couple of tools. Now, the first one is the Android SDK Manager. If you sit there and say you want to support Android 2.2 and above, this is where you'll go to download those versions of Android. And then there's the Android Virtual Device Manager. Now, this is where you actually go to set up all of your emulators. So we open that up. Now, the first thing I want to point out on this screen is over along the top, you'll actually have Android virtual devices and device definitions. Now, you can imagine scenarios where something like the Nexus 1, it's one device, but it's actually been upgraded through a couple of versions of Android. So realistically, you want emulators for each version of Android, but to that device definition. So that's the difference between the two. So if we open up device definitions, you'll notice that it's just a long list of devices. Along the top, we'll have ones that are provided by the SDK, which are the Nexus devices, the flagship ones from Google. And then below that, we'll have generic devices. Because in most cases, you can actually kind of put an Android device out in the wild into one of these categories for the most part. But if you ever find that there's one device that's actually causing you grief, like whether it be a particularly large screen size or it's something you're not expecting, you can actually add in your own device definitions. Something like the Galaxy S3 or Galaxy Note, where they have a particularly large screen, you can add it in, and you just do it once, and then you're set up. So the Android virtual devices, it's just a long list of devices which you would have set up. Here's some that I've got. But if you go in, I'll just quickly step through how to make your own. So we'll click on the new along the right-hand side. It's fairly self-explanatory. You just need to enter in a name for your emulator, something that you recognize. Then you have the option of selecting which device, so which device definition you want to use. Here we're going to go for the Nexus 7. And then you select which version of Android you want to use. Now, there are a couple of other options, but for the most part, I don't think you'd need to change any of them. But the one thing that I would like to highlight is this option down at the bottom, which is Use Host GPU. Now, what this basically enables the emulator to do is use some of the hardware power that you've got on the graphics card. Now, if your machine supports it, it vastly improves the use of the emulator because it speeds it up quite a bit. Now, it's only available on Ice Cream Sandwich and above, but if this is something you're looking at, definitely switch it on, because if it works on your machine, like I say, it makes it a lot more usable. And then, obviously, to start it is just a case of clicking on your emulator and clicking Start. Now, I won't lie, I have edited the video a little bit to make this nice and speedy. Our time's valuable, we need not waste it, but at the same time, if I just cut off at this point, it would feel a little bit harsh. So you only have to do this once. It may seem like quite a long process, but once you set up your emulators for devices you want to support, all you have to do is come into this tool and start them up. For the iOS simulators, it's a bit easier. If you have Xcode installed, you'll actually just have a drop-down option for Open Developer Tools and then iOS Simulator. And then within that, once it's started up on iPhone or iPad, whichever the last one was opened, it will allow you to change the hardware as well as the version. So once you set up the emulator and simulators, we move on to development. Now, I think it's fairly common that all of us, one way or another, will be using localhost. Now, the problem is, if you imagine something like the Android emulator, where it's emulating an entire platform, like it would on a device, well, that device has its own local host. So at which point, developing on your machine kind of starts raising the question of, well, what happens when I type in localhost? So I'd like to introduce your new home away from home, 10.0.2.2. Now, what this is just an IP address that Android have just left in the emulator, and it's like a backdoor. So what you're saying is, when I type in this, go to localhost on my actual machine. But then, even if you can get it on your emulators and simulators, what about a real device? Because normally, whenever we try and do this, it leads to a bit of pain, tears. Because obviously, you have to find the IP address of your machine, you have to type that in on the device. That's assuming that your network allows it, depending if you're on a corporate network or not. You then also have the issue of if you've got a configuration on your Apache server with subdomains, it doesn't quite work. It's not fun, it's not nice. So in the DevTools, there's actually a new tool that we've added in, which is called reverse port forwarding, that actually allows you to locally develop on your device. So you have to enable a flag in the beta or canary version of Chrome, which is enable developer tools experiments. And when you do that, you can actually go into Chrome Inspect, and when you open up Chrome on your Nexus device, or Android device, sorry, you'll notice it'll come up in the Chrome Inspect option. And you'll actually end up with an expected item like you've got down here. I've already opened up the developer tools in this case. So this is the developer tools for Chrome on Android. Now, because I've enabled the experiments flag, I've got this experiments menu item. Now, what you'll notice is I've actually enabled already enable reverse port forwarding. Now, what this is basically doing is saying, whenever I type in localhost port number on my mobile device, make it come onto my machine. So here, you'll see that I've got a number of ports already mapped. Now, these don't need to be the same port numbers, but the left-hand side is essentially the port number that I type in on the device. And then on the right-hand side, it's essentially saying localhost, and then the port number that's actually running on this machine. So if I switch over to this machine, now, if I make a typo, you'll have to excuse me. So this is Adi Osmani's to-do list app. But essentially, that's running off of my local machine. And just to prove that that's the case, if I switch back over to my laptop, I have the Android emulator already set up. And just to keep you on your toes, if you look at the iOS simulator, it's actually localhost instead of any kind of backdoor. Now, I'm hoping that's not going to try and use the Wi-Fi network to try and find that site, because it will not work. No? Go on. OK, we'll go back to that anyway. But this introduces a new problem, because essentially what we're doing is we suddenly got 2 emulators and simulators and 1 device. Now, normally when I'm developing, I'll have a mobile device, just a phone, I'll have a tablet, and then I might have a range of emulators of varying screen sizes just for this. And there's nothing controlling these things. They're all individually working on their own. So that's why I think it's starting to get to the point where you might want to think about having a device lab. Now, normally when people say device lab, you think, oh, I need to have 30 devices to warrant that kind of thing. That's not the case. If you've got a couple of devices on your desk, start thinking about using a piece of software to help you do it, and there's a range out there. So there's Adobe Edge Inspect, which is essentially you can download a Chrome extension, and then it will mirror that tab that's currently open onto any devices that have got the Adobe Edge app installed and opened. There's Paul Kinlan's Bootstrapping Your Own Test Lab, which is a small script which actually open up the browser on any connected Android emulators or devices to the correct URL. And then there's also this open source project, which is Remote Preview. Now, all this is doing is it's a small piece of JavaScript that's just checking a particular file. And essentially, whenever that URL changes, it sets the URL on an iframe in that web page. So the idea is that you put all of your mobile devices to this one URL, and then you've got one central place where when you change that URL, it changes across the board. So, if I switch back to the mobile device, all I'm going to do is just change the URL. Well, I just did it. But if I come back over to my laptop, you'll notice the Android browser is already changing, and the Safari one would be changing should it work, which it is. So I'll show you what I did. All I did was edit this one file, which is url.txt. And then when I change that, it starts affecting all the devices. So again, I'll show you on the mobile device because that's the only one that's playing ball. But again, it's just changed to the to-do list app. So it's a very simple thing because it means that should you ever get to the point where someone comes up to you and says, hey, you know what, I just need help on this project, and you're head deep in something else, you've only got to change one place, and then all the devices that are connected already start filtering through. And there's also this other website, opendevicelab.com, that I wanted to highlight, which is essentially, it's a list of device labs across the world that you can actually go to and check out. So if you live near one, find out what they're using to do this kind of work and figure out what pitfalls they've had, and it might solve some of the problems that you might be having in your own workflow. Another tool I wanted to talk about was Responsive Inspector. Now, this is a third-party Chrome extension made by Peter from the Adobe Creative Cloud team. And it's just a really nice way of viewing media queries. So what you're seeing here is essentially 3 different kinds of media queries, which is basically saying a media query where there's only a max width set, which is the orange one on the top, a media query where you've got a min and a maximum width defined, which is the green one in the center, and then the 2 blue ones along the bottom are the minimum width that's been defined. Now what this tool is really great for is if you actually click on one of these media queries, you'll notice the browser in the background snapping to those particular media queries. So it's a really nice, easy way of A, viewing what the media queries are doing, and secondly, just interacting with them in the same way. But you also have the option of going to the ruler, the measurement across the top, and forcing the browser to snap at a particular width, which is really nice if you've got media queries that are overlapping, and you want to ensure that things aren't actually conflicting. And the last feature, which I really am a fan of, is this CSS option at the side. Now, if you click on this for one particular media query, it'll actually take you to the CSS that's essentially that media query. Now, I found this tool really useful for, A, if I have a compilation step with perhaps JSLint optimizing CSS, etc., I'll check whether the actual version of the site that I'm looking at has those media queries in it. And secondly, if I'm having problems, something's not quite right, normally it's a case that the CSS isn't quite doing what I'm expecting, something's not in the right order. And in which case, this CSS option is really easy. So then we come on to testing. Now, raise your hand if you use the DevTools in Chrome, the Firebug in Firefox, Safari DevTools. Who here uses them? Now, keep your hand up if you'd actually be quite happy to live without them. Like they've just gone. Had no option to them. There's a couple of hands, which I'm surprised at. But the problem is, with the mobile web, we don't have those, right? They're a separate device, they're separate browsers, and generally the tools are only just starting to get there. But it's not on all platforms. If you look at something like the Android web view, there are no dev tools for that. You can't hook into them. So one of the tools that you'll actually find that most people will use is this tool called Winery, which is Web Inspector Remote. That's what it stands for. Some people call it Wiener. But essentially what it does is you put a little bit of JavaScript in your web page, and then if the APIs are actually there, what it'll do is it'll actually use some of the developer tool APIs to then give you a remote dev console like you'll see on the left. And the nice thing with this is you can actually edit the HTML, edit the CSS, play around with the JavaScript console just like you would on your actual local machine. If you wanted to play around with this, I'd strongly encourage just checking out debug.phonegap.com. It's actually a running server of this. And what's really nice as well is if you think about cloud-based testing, you can actually put the script in this, and if the server is actually in a local public place, you can remotely debug a cloud-based system. And then we come on to something like MeTool, which actually uses Winery. So it's a native iOS application. And essentially, when you actually load up a web page, it'll already start up Winery for you. It'll give you a URL, and you can just access it on a local network. If you go and use it on an iPad, it goes one step further, and it actually gives you Winery inside the application. So you can actually debug there and then on the device. But the really nice thing with MeTool as well is it's actually added a couple of features which you can't get in Safari DevTools. So it'll actually show you the composited layers as well as the draw count. So if you're finding performance might be a bit of an issue, you can actually start using this to find out what's going on. And I've already briefly touched on this, but this is the cloud-based testing idea. So I imagine a lot of you are kind of familiar with Browser Stack and Source Labs, and there are a number of other services, but Browser Stack comes from the idea of manual testing. You open up a couple of simulators, emulators, and you get to play around with them and interact with them. Now, Device Anywhere comes from a slightly different idea of real-time devices that you're actually getting screen captures from or webcams from. Now, the nice thing with this, if you're having a particular problem, perhaps a bug in the JavaScript or something on one particular device, this is a nice way of you can actually gain access to that because it comes with all the OEM tweaks rather than an Android emulator where it's just stock Android. And then Source Labs comes from more of an automated testing background. So let's talk about automated testing. There's kind of a couple of different ways of doing it. There's obviously unit tests. And if you develop unit tests, you may have them running locally. But you could also start looking at running them in the cloud. I was recently playing around with a couple of grunt tasks for Source Labs and Browser Stack, which actually take my unit tests in QUnit and run them on whatever simulator I tell it to. But then there's also test scripts. If anyone's ever worked with a QA team, you know that quite often they'll run scripts, they'll follow certain steps and see what the output is. So you can actually start doing this in browsers with something called WebDriver. Now, what WebDriver will allow you to do is essentially interact with the browser and control it in certain ways and perform certain tasks. And the way you can do this is essentially using a small little JavaScript in Node.js as well as a number of other platforms. But I'll go through a brief example in Node.js. So here's just a brief configuration for a browser that I want Source Labs to launch for me. So essentially, we're just saying, I want an Android tablet with version 4 of Android running. And then we have a small bit of code which is just setting up. So we're saying to the WebDriver, I'm going to use a remote connection to Source Labs. And then down the bottom, you'll notice I've got initialization step, which is just saying I want the browser of Android tablet. I'm passing in a GET request for the URL localhost. And this is because a lot of these services will enable you to make a local tunnel from your machine to their services. And then I'm saying take a screenshot. After that, check some navigation, and then quit. So if we look at taking a screenshot, the code is surprisingly simple. You literally just say, take a screenshot. You get a callback with a 64-bit encoded image. And then here I'm just using the file system API to save it. And then checking navigation, here I'm just saying, find the link inside an element with the ID blog, click that element, and then afterwards check what the actual URL of that current page is, and make sure that it's what I'm expecting. And I've done a full example which you can actually take and run yourself, which you'll pass in an array of browsers that you want to test on. It will then set the orientation to portrait. It'll take a screenshot, which is what you're seeing on the right-hand side. It doesn't just do the bit of the screen, it does the entire thing, if the body's set up correctly for the correct height. And then once it's actually done that, it'll check the navigation and then flip the orientation to make sure that the media queries are actually happening as they should be. And then the check navigation is just a small example of things that you can do. But WebDriver, you can do a number of other things. You can execute JavaScript directly into the page. You can also, with Source Labs, actually watch the entire recording of the tests running. So if there's certain things you want to do in terms of click this element and watch the DOM be manipulated, the visibility is changing on certain elements, or sizing's getting tweaked, you can actually just sit there, tell WebDriver to do this, and then watch the video that's captured on Source Lab. And the other thing I wanted to talk about was networking. Now, if we are just working on a local machine in our office, we're going to have a nice, beefy internet connection, hopefully. But obviously, mobile users aren't going to have this all the time. They may be at home on a nice Wi-Fi. They might be on 2G in the middle of the woods with barely any connection at all. So there's a couple of tools you can use to actually throttle your local network. So here's an example of using the link conditioner OSX. So on the left-hand side is when it's off, and the right-hand side is when it's on. And this is, I think, an edge connection. Now, the really nice thing with this tool is here you can see things are slowly getting loaded, but it's not particularly performant. But if you have a page like this where you've got a dark background, and then you're actually using some dark text on one particular item while a background image is loading, which is light, what you can actually find is you could just set a background color, which is light, and then suddenly people can actually read the text whereas before they wouldn't have been able to. And plus, it gives you an indication of what's actually happening, what a user is seeing. So then we have the live step. We've actually launched the product. It's out there, it's in the wild, people are using it, and it's awesome. But one way or another, through your development cycle, you will have made certain assumptions. We all do it. We all get to that point where we need to do it. But one of the things that you always have to make, and it's kind of a tough call, is breakpoints. Where do you decide where to change the look and feel of your web app to actually fit the range of devices? And Google Analytics kind of has this little hidden nugget of gold. And you can actually find out what the screen resolution of the mobile devices that are actually visiting your site. Now, the nice thing with this is you can actually realize that you can probably support 80% of your users with just a small number of configurations. Now, these are metrics that are actually taking into account the screen density. So it's the same as what your CSS media queries would be seeing. But what's even more interesting, if you look at number 1, you'll notice that the height, I think, is 768. Whereas if you look at number 4, it's 720. So it's only about 40 pixels different. But if you were to say, I'm going to put my breakpoint at 768, which I think is an iPad, and then everything below that gets the mobile experience, well, suddenly that 720 pixel width device is actually getting the phone UI rather than what you've already designed for a tablet. And that's a simple change. That's just changing it to 40 pixels less. So at that point, you're actually giving a better experience to a wider audience. And then there's also page speed. You can actually change the configuration, so you're only filtering on mobile and tablet traffic, so you can actually see what users are getting in the wild. Now, the nice thing with this is you can find out, A, if what your testing has been doing is actually matching what users are getting. But on the other side of it, if you sit there and say, I want to improve this, and you actually start making steps to do it, you can confirm that it's working through this. And ultimately, this is all going to feed back into what you do for the next project or whatever new features you come to develop, because ultimately, it's going to influence what your decision is going to be on terms of what emulators you test on, what platforms you test on. It's going to encourage you to look at the way you're going to continue the development. If you realize that it's too many devices to test against, perhaps you want to find out another way of doing it. Testing, hopefully if you've started playing with automated testing, you're going to have an idea of what works well, what doesn't work well, what things you could have really easily scripted that later became a bigger problem. And then live, well, again, mobile is never going to sit still. It's always changing. So at that point, you're going to be constantly iterating over what you want to support and how you're going to support it. And this is kind of the main point of the mobile web, right? Is it's still relatively new. Things are changing constantly. And these are just some of the tools you can use today in your workflow. But there's nothing to say that throughout your development of your next project, you're going to see more tools come out that are going to change the way you work or make things easier. Maybe even the case that you guys are actually making the tools for this. So I hope you enjoyed my talk. That's all I wanted to say. So I think we've got about 10 minutes for questions. If anyone has anything, we've got a mic there, if you want to queue up.
I've had the very unpleasant experience of trying to develop on a 12-hour overseas flight and realizing that to be able to tether an Android device to a laptop, you have to be able to hit App Engine in the cloud, which doesn't work if you don't have an internet connection.
Yep.
Is there anything that's being done to improve that?
So what I demoed was the actual local host from your desktop machine onto a device.
So with no network connection, you can do local remote port forwarding and everything will work?
Yeah, the only caveat is if you need to pull a couple of local host services, you do need to define each port. That's the only caveat that I found. So what happens is when you actually unplug your device, it will still save which ports you have set up for that device. So you can actually set up multiple ones and it will work.
Okay.
So you'll need to get beta for Chrome, and this feature hasn't added to it yet, but it will be coming very soon.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hey.
I'm a bit curious about the development workflow. Today, many of us are sitting in our text editor, and we're sitting, when we're making a change into our web application, we're sitting with the inspector. Today, we saw that the Android guys, they got Android Studio to give this fully integrated development experience.
Yep.
Is there any plans on bringing that to web? Because today, it's kind of an isolated world. I'm sitting in my editor, I'm going to my inspector, trying to memorize values, going back to my editor to save them.
So Paul Irish is actually doing a talk on DevTools in Chrome, and there's a load of new features that I think are addressing exactly that problem.
Okay.
And it's going to be exactly the same for this. So yeah, I definitely recommend checking that talk out.
Thanks.
Thank you. Cool. Thank you, everyone. My slides will be up with a load of the other I/O stuff. I haven't put a link up yet, but follow me on Google+ or Twitter, and I'll be tweeting them and everything else.